Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here. In a couple of days, I'll be taking on the Omega Protocol, the newest ultimate being introduced in patch 6.31. Ultimates are the crown difficulty in Final Fantasy XIV, taking encounters and stories from years past and tuning them up to be brutally difficult and punishing. It's something that those of us who are seeking the next challenge in the game really look forward to. So of course, everyone's been asking me the same question. Haps, you ready for Omega Ultimate? You gonna hop in? You world racing? All the usual stuff. Yeah, I'm gonna be going hardcore. And yeah, I've got sponsors lined up. I've got food prepared, snacks, and I've got all the time I need to get it done. So on one hand, I'm as excited as ever to hop into the next most difficult encounter for Final Fantasy XIV, that new hotness. On the other hand, though, something is still fresh enough on my mind to give me the slightest bit of pause, to pump the brakes on my adrenaline even in the smallest of ways. And that's the experience that came before it. No, I'm not talking about Criterion or Criterion Savage. I'm not talking about Abyssos. I'm talking about the ultimate that came out before, Dragonsong's Reprise. This encounter was the previous ultimate introduced in patch 6.11, and even amongst all the other ultimates that were already out, it's pretty much considered to be top dog. A compelling reimagining of the Heavensward story, absolutely brutal difficulty, and an endurance war, I'll call it, all in one. And while yeah, I think it was great, I also watched what it did to others. I watched it tear apart my fellow raider. I saw individuals throw themselves at this, not just to success like you see in the broken down tears of grown adults in clear videos, but to failure as well. Friends who burned out in ultimate content, in raiding, and in some cases in Final Fantasy XIV altogether when put to test against this monster of a fight. Now, this isn't a wholly unexpected thing. Previous ultimates have had this effects on individuals and groups. It's just kind of part of it. But there's something about Dragonsong's Reprise itself, the encounter itself, and what it demanded of the player. I mean, it shattered confidence, it shattered willpower, and of course, it shattered groups. So now, on the eve of the next chapter in Ultimate in Final Fantasy XIV, I wanted to explore why I think Dragonsong's Reprise was both the pinnacle of Final Fantasy XIV rating and should also seldom be repeated. First off, one of the more obvious elements, the length. Now, duration of encounter in Ultimate has been a hot topic for the developers themselves, dating back to when the world first team for the Unending Coil claimed that they thought the fight's length bordered on too long, right to Yoshi P's face. Now, that fight first clear clocked in at 18 minutes and 57 seconds, while the two that followed, Ultima Weapon and Alexander, clocked in at 15 minutes and 57 seconds and 17 minutes and 26 seconds, respectively. Now, there's a great deal of downtime during these fights, so even these aren't entirely accurate amongst the community members. Alexander, for example, would often be considered closer to 16 minutes given the amount of time you're not actually hitting the boss, but that's a whole nother detail, a whole nother story, even if it is somewhat relevant to this. The bottom line is you can only pull the boss so many times in a given day, especially once you're approaching that final kill time. So how long these encounters are, it matters not just for the endurance aspect, but for how many tries you can even get in a day to get it done. So what did DSR clock in at? Well, the kill video clocks in at 18 minutes and 48 seconds. Now that's just short of the same time that pushed people to the brink way back in the Unending Coil. However, DSR is the only ultimate with a door boss, and that time is not included in that almost 19 minutes. Every time you enter the instance, you got to clear through this initial mini-boss before you can even begin tackling the actual encounter. This takes just over 2.5 minutes as well, give or take a few seconds. Now, you don't just want to combine the door boss and actual boss timers and be like, oh, it was 21 to 22 minutes long. It just doesn't really work that way. But it just served to add to the tedium of clearing the fight, of working on the fight to the player. Another 2.5 minutes taken out of every instance at minimum. Because of course we all know you're bound to have some random wipes on it as you're trying to get back to the prog point that you were already at. We all know how the high tensions can get to people already. Now imagine wiping on this boss that is inconsequential in the grand scheme of your journey to the end of that nearly 19-minute enrage. Now, length is an element, but honestly, it's nothing on its own. No, how that time is used is also crucial because, what if there was 3 minutes of complete downtime where there's no target, there's no killing, there's no mechanics? Then all of a sudden, who cares about the 19 minutes, right? Now you're back down to 16 minutes and who's complaining? But that's not how DSR's time was used, and that's not the effect it had on the people doing the fight. So within the just under 19 minutes of the main Enrage, there are a total of 7 phases. Thornton 1, Nidhogg, Eyes, Save Our Boy, Thornton 2, Double Dragons, and Dragon King Thornton. While some phases are easier or harder than others, they each have a completely different set of mechanics. And yeah, you might recognize them from when you did the normal mode in the story or the extreme of one of the fights. Oh, whoop-de-doo. Realistically, the problem is that all of these phases are completely distinct from one another, and thus there's very little transferable knowledge between said phases. You'll be learning pretty much everything from scratch every time you make it to a new point in the fight, minus Save Our Boy, which is really just informed by the initial door boss, and kind of serves as the main purpose for the door boss as a whole. And that is drastically different from every previous ultimate. In the Unending Coil, you learn the first 2 phases, Twintania Nail, and then those 2 phases carry so much relevance for the next 10 minutes of the fight almost. Everything minus the very final phase. In Ultima Weapon, you learn the first 3 phases in these really short sections, and yeah, there's a whole nother puzzle going on there, but then for pretty much all of the final phase, all of this information is super relevant to you. And then in T, everything from Limit Cut 1 to the end of Phase 3 all has transferable knowledge. Even the final phase in T takes about 45 seconds to a minute to teach you all of the boss's mechanics before it starts throwing them all at you at once. DSR has absolutely none of that, minus the door boss to the Save Our Boy phase, like I mentioned before. Yeah, again, you might recognize stuff from the content outside of the Ultimate, but that's about it. The way it's used in Ultimate is entirely different. Heck, there's more transferable knowledge from doing the Unending Coil before DSR than there is to doing the bosses in DSR before doing DSR, which is absolutely wild. It's like you're starting over in every single phase, and that causes fatigue, especially in players who may not be as mentally prepared for this as they think. Now, that's not even including the fact that there are just straight up mechanic and mechanical checks in each phase that act as complete walls for many groups. I mean, you have Sanctity of the Ward in Thornton 1, pretty much all of Dive from Grace and Nidhogg, including Nash or Lash, Lash and Nash, all that stuff. Death of the Heavens in Thornton 2, Raw Flames and Double Dragons, and, the hidden Shakies mechanic you get on the final phase. And it's a lot for groups to overcome. Yeah, when you do overcome it, it's a great sense of accomplishment, but much like with the door boss, you have to account for people making mistakes and not doing these phases perfectly every single time you pull the boss. And as such, that fatigue, again, just starts to mount and mount and mount until for some people, it's just too much. It would really help to have some transferable knowledge between phases, maybe to, as much as I hate to say, to see Dive from Grace again, or to see something closer to Strength or Sanctity of the Ward in Thornton 2, and not what is essentially UCOB 2 Electric Boogaloo. Speaking of the final phase, it's also one of the more difficult final phases, which I think really, really hurts the soul at the end of the day. I think this is the main reason people break down in tears in almost every clear video. It's funny though, because I'd say that's a criticism of previous Ultimates. Oh, the final few minutes is too easy. It's always just, mitigate a party stack, do a tank mechanic, and then just dodge a bunch of dodgeable AoEs. And you know what? I'd say DSR does kind of do that, but it's the most strict mitigation and attention check of the bunch, especially given that there's this whole extra mechanic with the auto attacks where people need to know when they're going in, when they're coming out, what the timing is. And while it's all very static, it's a whole nother element to juggle on top of all the mechanics themselves. And if anyone dies, well, that's going to be a problem as well, because if they die at the wrong time, it might make that auto attack mechanic that you have to do for the entire phase completely unsolvable. So you can see someone go in the first 10 seconds and feel like you've completely lost it, that it's just all going to fall apart before you even have a chance to get any sort of rhythm going. And while that's not entirely true, it feels that way, and everyone can't help but think about it. There's very little to salvage from that compared to T, where you know, the tank dies and you still clear the fight with, you know, 10, 15 seconds to spare. Or UCOB, where you'll lose the buff, but you might still be able to progress and get people to get used to all the movements and mitigations and all that stuff, just as long as you can get that person alive in time. It's just so soul crushing to see a death in that phase, knowing the way the auto attack mechanic and the rest of the mechanics work. Now, I will give DSR some credit. It has points where it does kind of take it easy on the player to at least attempt to balance some of these elements out. It has almost no mechanics between phases. I think it only has Final Chorus going into Nidhogg, which hits hard, but it's, you know, it's just a room-wide AoE. It has the buff tethers going into Eyes, which is just everyone needs to stack. Ooh, big deal. And the bleeds plus the alternate end AoE going into Dragon King Thornton, which is, again, just 3 back-to-back AoEs with bleeds. It hurts because you wish you had those mitts for the entirety of the phase, but it's manageable, it's doable. I mean, this is a far cry from what we see in other ultimates. I mean, you have a limit cut going into the second phase of T, you have an Ifrit dash going into the second phase of Uwu, and I would consider Grand Octet to be one giant transitional mechanic into the ads phase of UCOB, not to mention every other mechanic leading up to that point. It also has a much more direct trick or puzzle, I'd call it. Unlike Ultima and T, which were pretty much designed entirely as puzzles, Ultima Weapon was deliberately designed to be more interesting to watch on stream than anything else, and it definitely shows. So it's not that DSR wasn't, you know, without its faults or without its points that made it a little bit less of what I'm claiming it was, but those other elements are so much more prevalent to the player that this is an afterthought compared to what all of that puts you through. So now I look to the task in front of me, the Omega Protocol, in 2 days, and I can't help but think to myself that there's almost nothing that they can do to me that I'm not already mentally prepared for. I mean, Yoshi P himself has gone on record saying that they didn't design it to be harder than DSR. They don't think it's harder than DSR, but they understand that difficulty is subjective and that it's just designed in a different way. So maybe somebody does find it harder, but I think they're just being, I don't know what the right word is. They just don't want to say it's easy. You know, it would be bad PR to say it's easy or it's easier. So this is almost like the nice way of saying it, I guess, is the best way. And if they're already saying that before I've played it, and I've already done DSR and I've already suffered through what I've suffered through, I feel mentally prepared. I feel ready because of what it came before. And I think that there's steps that they could take to ensure that, or steps that they probably did take to ensure that. I mean, I think that the length is going to be nearly identical when it comes to everything factored in with downtime. So I am actually thinking it'd be about T's length, you know, 17 and a half to 18 minutes, but maybe closer to 16 to 16 and a half with downtime. And also, I think the number of phases and the amount of transferable knowledge is going to be a lot higher in Omega. I mean, he's an adapting machine. Even in his own fights, he basically just constantly upgrades his own skills. And I think that we're going to see things that feel a lot more comfortable, things that feel a lot more familiar, and I think we'll see them in more phases than just one. I'm also just really hoping it only has 4 or 5 phases max. You know, I'm hoping it's Beetle Omega, Omega MNF, Final Omega, and then New God Ultimate, Ultra Instinct, Super Saiyan God Omega, or whatever the heck they're going to call them. In the description on the lodestone on the page, it makes it seem like he's going to get a soul. So I guess maybe we call him Dynamis Omega or Omega Soul or something like that. Omega Lol at this point. Just don't be 7 phases. Don't be everything is different from one another. Don't do that. Save that for another expansion. I think you can do another DSR again, but I think it needs to not be right now. I think after Abyssos and how that went, and I think after Criterion how that went, and after DSR and how that went, they need something that is absolutely ultimate difficulty, that is punishing, that is puzzling, and is a great spectacle for all to play and watch, but just not DSR. Just not on the same level, not on the same plane. Move along. We have other things to do. But yeah, that's where I'm at mentally, and we'll see how it turns out on Tuesday. With that, that's going to be a wrap for my video on Dragonsong Reprise and on Omega Protocol, I guess both at the same time. So thank you for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And if you want to follow all of the prog, I will be streaming 16 hours a day on Tuesday until we clear. And I'll also be posting highlight clips on YouTube as we reach new breakpoints, as we reach new phases, as we come up with major strategies for mechanics that people are progressing on. So that's going to be the majority of my content for the next week. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see all of you in the next one. Until then, take care.